Welcome to Go Solo Live.
Don't you mean go solo live? Have you ever been asked why on earth would you travel alone? Go Solo Live not only answers that question, but celebrates life as a midlife solo traveler. This is a safe place for women to come together to reminisce about their travels, encourage others to travel, and to dig into the real lessons learned from these journeys. Now join Jennifer Buchholz with Transform Via Travel as she and her guests share stories of the solo travelers of midlife women.
Hello, sisters, and welcome to this very special Mother's Day episode of Go Solo Live. This is Jennifer Buchholz with Transform Via Travel. It's time to sit back, grab a cup of coffee, enjoy my conversation with my travel mentor and grandmother, Sandy Duffy, as she shares stories about how she started traveling solo.
Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Sandy Duffy, otherwise known as my grandmother. Welcome, Sandy.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.
And this is such an honor for me to be able to share your story with our world, with the listeners, because I've told people for years that you've been an icon to me when it comes to travel and solo travel. And I've never really given anyone a chance to hear about you. So this is the chance to share. So thank you again. And this is a very special Mother's Day episode. So are you ready for me to start asking you some fabulous questions?
Yes, I am.
All right. Well, Grandma, let's start by saying, when did you start traveling solo?
Well, actually, I think I started about 2001, and it wasn't exactly solo. I went with girlfriends, and we went with a group sometimes, but we went to Australia and New Zealand, and that was our first really big trip, and it was just phenomenal. It was so much fun. The Australian people were wonderful. People in New Zealand were just marvelous. And we saw things and did things that we just had no idea would be available to us.
Well, let's get into that a little bit further. Give me some examples. What are some of the things that you saw and did?
Well, we went snorkeling on one of the coral reefs. We went to a botanical garden that had fruits and vegetables, many of which I had never seen. And we sat down to a phenomenal dinner of food that I was totally unfamiliar with. And I'm not necessarily shy when it comes to trying new foods or new cuisines. So it was just lovely. It was one of the lovely things we did. And it seemed to be, it flowed. Whereas we did a lot of things that were great fun, but were probably more commercial, like going to Ayers Rock and going to Sydney Harbor Bridge. And that was great fun. We went up on a windy day, so that was kind of cool. But it was also, by the time we got to Australia, a lot of these things had changed from, say, 10 or 20 or 30 years ago.
Well, so 17 years ago, when you started traveling solo, when you did this big trip, it was a girls' trip. But how many of you were actually married?
Well, one of us for sure, and one of us kind of, and the other two were divorced.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about you were married when you started doing these trips without Grandpa. What was that like? How did that emerge for you? How did those conversations go?
Well, Ed and I did a lot of traveling, driving trips in the U.S., and that's what he liked. And I wanted to do other things, and it started with biking. And I wanted to do a biking trip in Ireland, and he just wasn't interested. But he was also very supportive. He said, well, if you want to go, then go. It meant a lot of time away because I spent a lot of time on my bike before I went to Ireland to get into shape for all the lovely hills. But he was good about it. He was really good about it. I mean, even before then, did simple weekend things. I think he saw how much I enjoyed some of these things, and he just wasn't about to stop me. He knew he could join me if he wanted to, and he didn't want to. So at that point, decided I need to do what I want to do, not what he wants to do. And that's where the traveling without my husband took me to.
So this is a big deal. And I don't know that enough people really put their time into exploring that further. And I want to make sure that we're taking a moment with this. So you both did stuff together. It's not that you only traveled solo, but if it was something that he wasn't going to enjoy, he had no problem saying, why don't you go do it on your own? And you had no problem going to do it on your own.
Exactly, and I never could figure out. And I came from a generation where women and men were pretty tightly stuck together once they were married. They hardly ever did anything separately unless the guy went hunting. Among my married friends, I was really the only person who did this among my circle of friends. Now, I'm sure there are other people who handled this way differently, but in my circle of friends, women didn't do that. And so I was very fortunate to be able to have these conversations with Ed and with, having him say, fine, that's good. And I'm really glad I did. Not only don't regret it, I'm absolutely delighted that I did it, because I would have missed so much had I not.
And this is why I really consider you to be a trailblazer in this. Part of that is just because this is how I was exposed to travel as a solo female traveler, is like listening to your stories, understanding that you and Ed had an agreement about, what this looked like, and that you both took time to do your own thing. It wasn't just, you were going and left him alone. Certainly, I didn't get the impression that he had given you permission. It was really just, this is how we've negotiated, one part of our marriage. Is that about right?
I would say you're exactly right.
And what I really appreciated, as you shared these stories with me over the years, was that you were not only a trailblazer, I believe, to me, granddaughter, so there's a generational, I believe, admiration sort of built in there. But I believe that you were somewhat of a trailblazer for your peers and for your friends. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, and that could be, although my divorced friends, divorce is very freeing sometimes, and they were pretty ready to go. So I was fortunate to have women who were a little bit more able to do some of the things that we all wanted to do. And that worked really, really well for all of us. It's hard sometimes to find a traveling companion if you want one, although I have friends who travel all alone everywhere, and they negotiate that just beautifully.
And I think the options for that are certainly different now, as you can make connections with people virtually, or, do more research virtually, than I think even again, when you started traveling, you weren't probably even leveraging the internet to the same degree and doing the research. There was a lot more trust involved in some of that travel.
I think so. And you're right. Now, the internet is a huge help. But then I don't think I took advantage of it, maybe didn't understand it, and of course it wasn't as much available.
Right, for sure. So we started with the conversation about your big girlfriend's trip to New Zealand and Australia. And that is a massive investment of time and energy. How did you guys negotiate traveling together in a situation where, even though you've been friends, maybe you haven't come across all of the idiosyncrasies that start to emerge when you're in a situation where you travel together? How did you guys negotiate some of those interpersonal challenges?
Well, all in all, the group is pretty relaxed. Not that we don't all have a few things that would drive each other crazy over time, or maybe not even over time. But what we did is every time we went to a different city, we changed roommates, and that worked out really well because there were four of us. And we've usually done that when we've traveled, is we don't always stay with the same person. So one night it would be Pat and Judy, and then it would be Pat and Lonnie, and then it would be Pat and I, and then we go around again. And that way we got to know each other all a little bit better. Pat and Lonnie hadn't known each other real well. So, it worked out in that respect too, as far as building friendships. And it worked out, I don't know, your conversations change with different people, of course, and you didn't get too weary of somebody.
Absolutely. And how long were you guys traveling?
This was a 3-week trip, maybe a little bit more.
Okay, that is a long time. And what were you going to say? It's a lot of...
Well, I don't remember what I was going to say. If it doesn't come out right away, it's gone.
I understand that. That's not a problem. Now, the other part is, as we talked about, technology is different. As now an 81-year-old woman, I know that you're one of the most tech-savvy people that I know in your age group. But tech was entirely different, that 15, 20 years ago. How did technology help or hinder your travels then, as you might have seen then as you traveled more in the more recent past?
Well, of course, the fact that the internet is so readily available. And there were things I did use it for and things I didn't that were, maybe something was available to me, but I didn't personally have any need to use it. So I think the security of having a phone was just huge. and the information that's stored on your phone that you don't have to carry with you. That makes a big difference too. You know where it is. So as long as you hold on to your phone, you're okay.
Very good point. Well, I want to start fast forwarding a little bit because while you did start out with this girls' trip without your spouse, you've done other trips that you've gone on without anyone that you know. How did you start with that, and how did you connect to those opportunities?
Well, there was a group that I traveled with, not all the time, but often. And, well, because of my age sometimes and because of some other physical issues, I decided not usually to go all alone. I always wanted the comfort of a group. And I knew a group that you could be as independent within this group as you wanted to be. You didn't have to, be lockstep with what the group did. So that worked really well for me. And the group was small, maybe 9 people. And it just, if I wanted to go somewhere and nobody wanted to go with me, I just thought, well, I'm going to go. And I wanted to go to Vietnam real badly, and I couldn't interest any of my friends in that. And I just decided then that would be what I would do. And it was a wonderful trip. And it didn't really make a whole lot of difference not to have a friend. You met people along the way. There were the people in my group, and we always had a great tour guide. So it worked real well for me. I mean, I've done a number of places by myself, and I've just always found that it was a good experience.
So who have you had the most success doing those types of trips with? What organization?
Well, I've used Overseas Adventure Travel, and that's very good. They also have like a sister group, which is Grand Circle. Usually the trips are maybe a little less active, a little larger, and maybe geared more like often to somebody my age. But I could travel with this Overseas Adventure Travel. And as long as I could keep up, I didn't worry about it, and I always could. So that worked really well for me. I had people who were a little bit more active and sometimes a little bit more interesting. Not necessarily, I shouldn't say that.
Well, so what made you want to go to Vietnam?
Well, I've been to China and Japan, and Ed and I took that trip together. It was our first and his only, I think, foreign travel experience. And he liked it. It wasn't that. Nothing else ever really happened with foreign travel and Ed. But I just was fascinated with the culture, with the cuisine. And I knew I wanted to go back. I'd love to go back. I missed my opportunity for some things like Bhutan and Nepal. But I've just always been fascinated with Asian culture. So I think that was part of it. Vietnam was part of a list of places to go.
Awesome. So how did you navigate like that list of places? Was there literally a list? Was it just something that you looked for certain opportunities?
I think it was kind of a list, but it's a shifting list. And yes, I looked for certain opportunities. And oftentimes I'd get the idea that I really want to do this, and maybe I want to do this in 2 months, which is not a whole lot of time for some arrangements. So then I had to see what was available, if it was something I wanted. And I didn't do it unless it was something that I really wanted. I mean, I didn't do it just for the sake of availability.
Okay.
And that's kind of how I did that. At some trips I planned more, but others less.
Did you have some criteria that you were looking for in the trips that you were making your decisions to go on?
Well, if I looked at a specific place like Vietnam, there may have been specific things I wanted to see or specific cities I wanted to visit. And I would see how much of that the trip offered. And the pacing of the trip, well, I didn't mind a faster pace, but then every so often I'd like a few nights stay somewhere, at least 3 nights. So, it depended on the itinerary. That was a factor. And then I also had to, it was a give and take. Some things I maybe wanted to see, but they weren't offered on that trip, but other things were. And then I had to decide what was most important.
And we're going to talk about some of the highlights, some of the best things that you've seen, and some of the challenges. And I'm going to lead with the challenges because I remember some of the stories of this as you told me as they'd occurred, which was, I thought one of your more challenging trips was the trip in the Grand Canyon.
That was a challenging trip, and it was just a magnificent trip. And I always think everybody in the U.S. for sure, not everybody in the world, but everybody in the U.S. should go to the Grand Canyon. It's just such a treasure. I had a girlfriend, she initiated that one. She was, I think, 75, and she said, if I don't go pretty soon, it's not going to happen. So we all joined in. There were 4 of us, and the trip was 2-pronged. There was the good and the bad. And the bad started like the second night in where one of my friends became quite ill. And then 2 nights later, another friend became really ill. Both of them had to be helicoptered out, which is rare, even more rare to have 2 people on a trip. Plus, there was another woman who became ill. So they had 3 people helicoptered out on that trip. And the guides were just so freaked out. I mean, they just couldn't have anything like that happen.
No,
and
that's a pretty big deal.
And it's hard to say why. Everybody was certainly hydrated. They took care of electrolytes and all of that. Of course, then after the first 3 days when all these people left, everybody else kind of looked at my friend and I and go like, okay, well, when are those 2 going?
Like you guys were the next trip.
Well, no, we weren't. But I mean, we were among the older people on the trip. So everybody who had left so far was pretty much our age group. And then it was my friend and I and then another guy who, otherwise everybody was like 20, 30, 40, 50. They were much younger. But we did almost everything that everybody else did. There were some optional hikes, and I know one in particular was at noon, and the temperature was 120, and I opted out of that. So, but other hikes were wonderful. We had wonderful, wonderful adventures, and we slept under the stars every night, and we were in the water a lot by choice, and there wasn't anything about it that wasn't good. The food was excellent. The guides were very good. The people on the trip were just perfect. So those are the kinds of trips in a way. It's really funny. I really loved the most when we were active. We were doing something like that. My biking trips, my Grand Canyon trip, and my Boundary Water trips are trips that I just thought were absolutely marvelous.
Well, and you were truly inspirational to me about the Grand Canyon. Was your friend who wanted to go on the trip, was she the one who was able to complete it with you?
Yes.
Even better.
The other 2 are experienced travelers, and one of the women who was ill is extremely experienced. She maybe does 3 or 4 major trips a year, a lot of them hiking trips that are, rigorous.
Yes.
And so it wasn't that. It was a matter of what kind of shape you were in. They were in intensive care for 4 days. I mean, they were sick.
Well,
they were really sick.
Let's talk for a moment about, I did the Grand Canyon in a more modified way. I don't think I was nearly as adventurous as you. And 3 of my former students, and we were all in our 30s or 40s when we went, and we did a rafting trip down the second part of the Grand Canyon, which was incredible. But it gives me some perspective on what it's like then to get helicoptered out of a place like that. And it's not something easy. Like, this is very technical. There are a lot of logistics involved, and these organizers who are leading these trips are doing a lot of work to make sure everybody stays safe in all the different things that they have going on. So what were the logistics that started to get involved then in terms of cost of the helicopter and cost of the stay? Was there travel insurance? Do you remember any of those details?
Not to be very accurate, I know my friends had insurance, and I know there was cost involved, but I don't know what the cost was, and I don't know what the insurance paid. I think at that time maybe paid a good portion of it. And technologically, they had to be able to land somewhere. Not an easy thing to find some place to land near where you are. And the other thing was, for when our guides tried to call out to get a signal, to make a phone call, was very, very, very difficult.
Yeah. Again, the technology may be better on that right now, but it is certainly something else.
Mm-hmm. Well, it could be better, yeah. Well, it's probably no different than in some rural areas you're in where you can't get a signal.
Good point. So again, I want to make sure everybody heard, this was a 75-year-old woman saying to a group of people, if I don't get to the Grand Canyon now, I'll never get there. I mean, there are not lacking spirit and adventure. So on one hand, I want my audience to sit here, it's never too late to start, which I think is great. But the other part of that is, Grandma, as you've aged, you've been really strategic about doing certain trips at certain times because you wanted to make sure that you were physically able to manage them without being a burden and without it being too challenging for you. Can you talk a little bit about how that journey evolved for you?
The last trip I took was to China. I was 79 then, and that was going to be the trip that let me know whether or not I could really keep doing this kind of thing. And my trip to China was amazing. I was able to manage all sorts of things, and it was certainly a very active trip. And I finished the trip knowing that I could continue to travel. Since then, things have changed a little bit, and now I'm really cautious about what I might do because I don't want to be struggling. So I really am thinking over like what I'm going to do and when I'm going to do it and how I'm going to do it. But my trip to China, being my last big trip of this type, ended up to be a good way to go out on traveling, if that's exactly what it is, if that's going to happen. And surprisingly, the first trip that Ed and I took was to China and Japan. So it kind of like made full circle.
I was going to say, there is some sweet synchronicity with that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think one of the things that you've also been able to do is inspire those around you to travel. And I want to specifically go to what I remember growing up when I knew that you took your granddaughters to elder hostels.
Yes, and that was great fun and memorable.
Can you talk a little bit more about like what you, not just like you wanted to go have quality time with them, but what was that real experience about, and why was that an important thing for you to do to pass on this spirit to that next generation?
We had cool adventures together. We did different things. Nell and I did a wagon train, and we got to sleep outside and either in a tent or under the stars, and they got to cook over an open fire, and we were in a wagon when the horse took off and ran away, so that was exciting. We had a lot of things going on that were a lot of fun to do, and we did them together. Or we did one in northern Wisconsin where they got to go ice fishing, and they got to sit in the woods, and birds would come and sit on their shoulders, and we got to do rock climbing and, all these things. And the kids did them and the grandmas did them and grandpas. And so everybody did it together. And we just we had a big New Year's Eve party. It was just probably time that you wouldn't normally spend with your grandkids in that way. Lindsay and I went to Washington, D.C., and it was a marvel. She had such fun with the other grandmas and grandpas, and that was really cool. So much history came alive to her. She just loved it. And Gracie and I we did a couple. One was in Nova Scotia, Anna Green Gables. And I just kind of found out how competent Gracie was, and that was cool. And one time we went to Galveston and found out about the hurricane and all sorts of, we did kayaking, and we were in the low-lying waters. Everything was fun. We did so many things that worked really well.
That's fantastic. So again, I think that's something that you've been able to inspire into the next generations. And all of your granddaughters have traveled extensively, really. I think it's something that when you're shown how to do it, it makes a big difference. It makes it a little bit safer.
I think that's true with so many things. If you have somebody who will show you the way, then it just seems to be a natural thing to do.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. So, when you think back, what are some of the most memorable trips that you've done that we maybe haven't talked about so far?
Everything was good. There was no trip I took that wasn't good, but I loved Greece and the Greek Isles. I loved the Mediterranean, Italy. Would have liked to have done more in Northern Africa. But, and Africa was really good. And India was really good. They're all marvelous.
Who is eating their ice cream cone and being like, I like this flavor and I like this flavor. That's great.
The other thing is the food. I love the food in so many places. Their food is, practically picked from the garden and cooked for you. I mean, it's just amazing. And fresh food and truly homemade food. That is marvelous. Different way of eating, not so much fast.
So you've said that everything has been good, but not everybody listening has known all the amazing places that you've been. And I'm certain that it's not the easiest thing. I didn't ask you to prepare much for our conversation today, but you've mentioned China and you've mentioned, of course, the Middle East and Africa, but Africa's a big place. Where did you go in Africa? What did you do?
Well, we were in South Africa, and I think that's interesting mainly because of the social issues in South Africa. They also have wine country. So South Africa kind of goes from, being very lovely to being problematic. And it's interesting to go into cities where you are in, like Johannesburg and cities like that, where you are definitely in a minority. And because you're a different feel, it's way different than just walking through a minority neighborhood or a majority minority neighborhood. And Africa was interesting. We went to Zimbabwe and we went to Kenya, and we went to Egypt. I'm trying to think what else, Botswana. Yeah, we went to, a good number of countries, and there's a good number more to explore. It's a huge place, huge, and it all has incredible history.
And again, this is an example of you've done some trips with friends, you've done some trips with these other organizations where you didn't necessarily know who was going to be on the trip. Did you ever make any connections on those adventures that you stayed in touch with?
No, I don't think I did, but I know people who did. And there were people on the trip that we were very close to at the time. There's a couple people over time that we stayed in touch with. We stayed in touch for a while, but I personally didn't, but I know people who did, and it would have been easy to do.
Very cool. So what is next for you when you start thinking about travel?
Well, I'm still thinking about it, and I'm thinking, maybe a cruise. I don't know. I mean, at one time, a cruise would have appealed to me, and then at another time it went up because I really couldn't see myself having that kind of a vacation. Laying on the beach used to appeal to me, not so much anymore. So, I enjoyed the trips I did where I either was very active, participant by biking or paddling, or trips where viewing, we're going to historical places and museums and all this other cool stuff. And so I can't quite get used to the fact that I may be doing a trip where I'm not quite as active. So I'm trying to figure that out yet. I think it would be something like a cruise. I don't want to be going from place to place every couple nights. That has lost its appeal, whereas before that was not an issue. That was just like, let's go and see what we can see.
And what about your friends? Because you have done some travel with friends. Where are they in their travels at this point? And, is that something that you guys have talked about going together? Are you looking to stay more taking care of this just yourself?
Well, some people that I traveled with are still traveling and some not. And so it's kind of a toss-up. And I think probably more of my friends who are my age are slowing down with travel. My younger friends who I traveled with, they're still going, and as they should be.
When you think about someone, now again, it's not that you hadn't traveled before you started doing some of these adventures, but it was a different type of travel at that point. So when you think about someone who's maybe my age, mid-40s, and are considering, whether they should travel solo for that first time, what's some advice that you'd be passing on to them?
Oh, I don't know how good I am at advice. Ha ha.
Oh, irony, Grandma.
Well, I would say go for it. Know what you can about it. I mean, don't just jump in blindly, but, check it out and take the leap. And I think it would be fine. I think it would be good. It would work. You've done that, and it's worked for you. And I think you check things out and try to figure out what it is that you're looking for and what it is that it offers. And there's always a safety concern. For that matter, there's a safety concern no matter where you go. I think just do it and talk to people who have traveled. See what, people have good hints about how to pack light and what to carry and what not to bother with and all that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just the ideas of, you don't have to make it more complicated than what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And any regrets? And when I mean regrets, I'm not just saying like in general. Is there times that you wish somebody would have been there with you? Is there times that you wished you could have shared that with your husband? Are there times that, at this point, are there places that you wish you would have gone that you haven't really had the chance to do and you're not sure if you will?
Well, I wish I could have shared everything with Ed. I wish he would have been interested in it, but he wasn't. And I don't want to coerce somebody into doing something with me, and I don't think that would have worked for us. So as it turned out, it worked fine just the way it was. But he missed a lot. Sometimes I'd come home so enthused about things. And my friends who didn't travel were like not real interested. And I always felt a little bit bad about that because I thought, I saw so much that was so really exciting, and I'd love to share it with you. And I did that with one trip. I made him listen. I didn't do that again. Anyhow, and there's a lot of places I would like to have seen that I didn't, especially Nepal and Bhutan. And we had an opportunity to extend our India trip into Bhutan. But I think we were in India 3.5 weeks, and by then we were done. You get sometimes to the point where we're done. And So that's mixed also. I didn't do it because I probably at the time I couldn't have appreciated it because I was too tired. But I wish I would have done it because I could have done it then. And that, in my estimation, is a pretty physical trip. You have to be able to do a lot of walking. And not just walking, you're doing a lot of climbing.
Right. Absolutely.
So almost everywhere I'd love to go back to Greece. There's just so many places and they're all so beautiful. Or many are so beautiful.
So how do you keep that close to your heart? How do you keep your travels with you and still feel that sense of those places or the adventures that you've had?
Well, of course, I have tons of pictures. And then every so often on Facebook, something comes up as you were here a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago. But I do think about it, it comes to mind. And then, of course, I have people like you who are traveling and who are interested in travel, and we talk about it sometimes. So, it's kind of there. It's not maybe right up front, but it's always there. And then, of course, when you read the newspaper or you're watching TV and you go, oh, I was there. I saw that. Yeah, I know where that is. So that's always good.
Well, you have a whole different frame of reference or context for world events or what's going on because you've been there.
Absolutely. I don't know how anybody can function in any, say, major position in any country in the world without having traveled. If people haven't traveled, your view is so narrow, it's so parochial, and they say travel broadens. Well, it does. It truly does. It makes you understand that there's all sorts of people in this world, and maybe you're more tolerant of all the differences in your neighborhood and in your own city.
So what's the biggest gift that travel has given you, Grandma?
Well, I think just that. It's opened my eyes to such a wide variety of people and places and cultures. And I think more than reading about it or seeing it in a movie, actually standing there, being in it, is just so important. Little school kids in India or, whatever. It's important to be there.
I think that's probably the best note that we could end on. I actually am getting a little bit emotional. I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us today. And I know that we could probably sit around and just gab about travel forever. And I continue to admire that you, again, were a trailblazer. You are my idol in solo travel. And
well, thank you. You're embarrassing me, Jenny.
That's okay, Grandma. You deserve it. And I'm so blessed that we've been able to share these stories together. So thank you for your time today.
Well, you're welcome. And thank you very much for considering me. Love you.
Love you too.
Wasn't it great to hear the stories that Sandy shared with us today? She has been my idol forever as I saw her go all over the world. And I love that she was willing to share some of that with you. If you love these stories and want to help support Go Solo Live, you can do that by making a small financial contribution to the show. There's lots of options with some great gifts of appreciation at www.patreon, that's patreon.com/Go Solo Live. We're also excited to launch a collaborative effort between A Path Less Taken and Transform Via Travel. Kelly and I will be leading 20 women to New Zealand in January of 2019. There's more details on the Transform Via Travel website, or feel free to drop me an email at jennifer@transformviatravel.com. Until next time, remember, go solo, not alone.